again. I'd like to acknowledge we are on the lands of the Dharawal people, pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any other fellow Aboriginal people here today. Well, I'm delighted again to welcome the Premier to Campbelltown, as well as Minister Rose Jackson and Minister Jodie Harrison for what is a fantastic announcement of a program that works very well here in Campbelltown, but I will leave the details of that to the Premier and Lynn and everyone else from the Benevolent Society. But before I hand over to the Premier, I just want to thank the Premier and the Ministers for their hard work in this space to provide services like we have here in Campbelltown at the Benevolent Society with the resources they need to help and protect some of the most vulnerable people in our community, and those are the victims and the scourge of domestic and family violence. People in Campbelltown and our region live it every day. I say that as a local member, but the reality is it's right across New South Wales. And I want to commend the Premier and the government for taking, the immediate action to make sure that we are resourcing great services like we see here at the Benevolent Society with what they need to do the important work that they do. We know many of them work so hard, and much of the services that they provide relies on their goodwill. But we know that that is not sustainable. That's why this program's so good. Minzy, over to you, mate.
Thanks, Greg. So today the government's announcing a $230 million package for domestic, family and sexual violence in our community. But I need to say that this is not a day of joy or boasting from the New South Wales government. This package is being demanded by the victims and survivors of domestic, family and sexual violence in New South Wales. It's a recognition that the state needs to do more and that something needs to change. I'm truly sorry that these reforms are being announced today and not earlier than today. And the bottom line here is that all governments need to do better, and that includes my government in New South Wales. We're determined to learn the lessons from those who've lost their lives at the hands of a violent partner, and that their deaths not be in vain, and that we do everything we possibly can to prevent more violence in our community, particularly those that are suffering in silence, particularly from those from communities that so far haven't been able to access help and support or justice from the criminal justice system. Today's package includes a number of elements, if I can briefly touch on them. Staying Home, Leaving Violence program, a wonderful and important program that's currently offered in part of the state, but not everywhere in the state. As a result of this funding injection, every woman in New South Wales will have access to this program. There's more to do, and if you speak to Lynn, she'll tell you that the books are closed here in southwestern Sydney. So clearly there is a major call for it amongst victims, survivors of domestic violence in the community. We're also proposing more money for an early intervention program. Part of that initiative includes support and counselling for the children of women who are fleeing domestic violence situations. There is, for the first time, a primary prevention program in our schools and in our communities, working with stakeholder groups, many of whom are desperate to, in a thoughtful and constructive way, change the culture in our community and our society that may lead to instances of family and domestic violence in New South Wales. There's more money for the sector, particularly Domestic Violence New South Wales. There's more money for research grants so that we can truly study and identify commonalities amongst perpetrators of violence against women in New South Wales, so that we can have targeted programs either from the Criminal Justice Network or education programs in our community. And importantly, and perhaps a little underrated, but particularly important when you consider how many government and non-government programs are available and how many acronyms are thrown around by the sector, it's particularly opaque. It may be difficult to navigate. Even for those that are charged with the responsibility of coming up with reforms in this area find it hard to navigate the various programs that are on board. So an integrated domestic and family violence service, which is designed to help women in particular navigate a complex system. Now, we've inherited a system that's effectively been built one on top of the other, and many of the programs and projects that are attempted by community groups, not-for-profit agencies and government programs do a great job. Many of them don't overlap with one another, but it may not be automatically apparent to a survivor of domestic and family violence that's fleeing a violent household how to access this important information and support and funding when and where they need it. And oftentimes, unfortunately, the clock is ticking. They need to get access to these funds immediately. This is the first announcement of our government, major announcement, when it comes to domestic and family violence. There's a lot more to do in this space. And the truth of the matter is this is only a first step. But we have heard loud and clear the call from the family members of those who've been killed at the hands of a violent partner. And the message from my government today is more needs to be done. We're very sorry that this package was not released or announced earlier, but we're determined to learn from the mistakes that have been made by my government and previous governments over the past decades. I'm going to pass over to Jodie.
Nearly 1 in 4 women and nearly 1 in 8 men across Australia experience some form of intimate partner or family violence after the age of 15. They're pretty disturbing statistics, but they're not just statistics. Behind every one of those statistics lies a story and people whose lives have been affected. That clearly is not good enough. We need to do more, and today's announcement is really about accepting, acknowledging and doing, starting to do that more. This $230 million package that's being announced today is really an initial step, our first phase in our response to domestic and family violence. It encompasses improved responses at a crisis level. It encompasses improved responses in early intervention. Really importantly, it provides the state's first dedicated primary prevention strategy for domestic, family and sexual violence. That's a strategy that's been worked up with more than 100 councils across the state. It's a strategy that's been worked up with key stakeholders in the state. And it's a strategy that's been developed with people with lived experience of domestic and family violence. It'll be funded to a tune of $38 million as part of the package. And what it will do is it will provide resources, it'll provide grants to communities across New South Wales so that each of those communities can develop targeted responses that are aimed at preventing domestic violence in their communities before it starts. It's really about providing the resources to community members who want to be part of the solution. We know we need to do our part as the government, and we want the community to work with us to do exactly that, because 1 in 4 and 1 in 8 is simply not good enough.
Today we're taking the first step in the New South Wales Government's response to the community's call to do more to stop men's violence against women. It's the first step, but it's not the final step. It's really important that that first step includes primary prevention. That's where this has got to start. Not just developing a prevention strategy, but funding that strategy so that it's more than just a piece of paper sitting in a drawer. It's an active document that guides the state's work preventing violence happening in the first place. It's really important that the first step is including the expansion of the Staying Home Leaving Violence package. That package at its core says to women, you shouldn't have to be the ones to leave the family home. You shouldn't have to be the ones to take your kids, relocate them, get them settled in new schools, find new employment opportunities, make new connections. The core of that strategy is to try and ensure that where possible and where safe, the woman is the one, the victim is the one who can stay in the home, and it's the perpetrator who has to leave and find somewhere else to stay. Now, that's not always going to be possible. Of course, women's safety calls us to ensure that there are accommodation options outside the home, and we know we need to do more in that space. But the first step, for me, has to be that the victim and her children should not be the ones who are relocating, and statewide availability of staying home, leaving violence is a really important first step. There are other parts of this package that are really, really important and importantly have been called for by the sector. This is not a ticker box from the New South Wales government. This is not flash in the pan. This is not thought bubble stuff. This is deeply considered work that we have been doing with the sector and are choosing this moment to step out as change makers, step forward, accept our responsibility to do more and start the work of laying out the full suite of responses. Look, as the Premier said, it was enough when Danielle Finlay-Jones died. It was enough when Lily James died. It was enough when any one of the scores of women who have died at the hands of male violence over the past years for governments to step up and do more. And we acknowledge and apologise that governments have been too slow off the mark. But our government is determined to use this moment now to not just talk, but to show action. $230 million today is only the first step, but that focus on keeping women safe in the home and that focus on primary prevention is the right place to start. And it's fantastic to be here with a partner like the Benevolent Society who've been showing us what works, who know how this system can do better. And listening to them and partnering with them is a really important way that we want to make sure that we're putting our shoulder behind the evidence, the things that work and the things that are going to protect women. And with that, I'll hand over to Lynn Hatfield-Stodd, CEO of the Benevolent Society.
Thank you, Minister, Premier and our local member here. I too pay my respects to the Darawal people whose land we're on this morning. And also I pay my respects to the women who've lost their lives through intimate and family violence. Look, the package that the Premier and the Ministers have just announced today is a solid package. It's a solid package because I think this is a government that has been working with the sector and it's very clear it's got sector fingerprints all over it and the fingerprints of frontline domestic and family crisis workers all over it. Our team here in Campbelltown who work in the Staying Home Leaving Violence program tell me all the time that what women and children who are living with family and intimate violence need. They need specialist services to support them, and that's services like the ones we operate here. They need, as the Minister said, housing options, both staying at home and leaving home when they need to do that. But more than that, if we actually want to stop the epidemic of intimate and family violence in this nation, we need what's happening now to continue. We need every government across Australia to put their shoulders to the wheel, to work individually with packages like we've seen today, to work collectively through the National Cabinet and COAG processes. We need non-government organisations, charities like my own, who deliver the services to partner with governments, to partner with Corporate Australia. And I take this moment to put out a call to Corporate Australia. We really want to partner with you. NGOs are desperate to partner with you, as we do with governments, to invest, to work with your workforces, to work in the communities with you as we do in other spaces, to actually start putting an end and turning off the tap to intimate and family violence. So to stand by saying it's a solid package, it's a great step. It's really good to hear Premiers and Ministers talking about this being a step in the right direction. Domestic violence isn't going to stop in 1 year or 5 years. This is probably a 10-year, 15-year attention we've got to pay as a nation if we're serious about this, and it's starting from the social change we need to see across our communities right through to investing in the specialist services like we run here from this site in Campbelltown. Thank you.
I think that's everyone, so we're all happy to take questions. Thanks, Lynn.
Can I ask from a practical point of view, might be for you, Premier, one of the ministers, how does the process of the staying at home program work? Is there a means of ensuring the perpetrator leaves?
Lynn's team run it, so perhaps I can pass over.
So there's we have specialist workers that work with women who approach us and come here, and then we provide them with technology and social and clinical supports to stay at home, to make sure that they're safe, to make sure that if aggression starts or violence is starting, they're able to let people know quickly. So it's having those fast loops, but more than that, it's actually about working with women and their children to make sure that they're stabilised and that the women can get the support they need and the counselling they need to feel strong in themselves and to be able to stay home and to feel safe in their home.
So the perpetrator is still in the home, though?
The perpetrator can be in the home. Sometimes the perpetrator leaves the home. So it really depends. It depends on the level of violence. It depends what the woman wants as well, and it depends what our people can negotiate. So, but it's what happens in traditional domestic violence programs is usually they kick in after the woman has taken her children and left the home, and what that does is start that woman and her children into what's often an intergenerational kind of slide into poverty. So they don't have stable housing. They usually have to leave their job. The staff here were talking to the Premier and the ministers today and just saying when men are engaged in this kind of violence, when perpetrators are engaged in this violence, they're looking at every avenue to control the women and children's lives. And so anything that can keep women and children stable in a home they know, in the community they know, with the social and economic supports they've already got access to, is a good thing. So it's us going into the home and working with the women, and particularly the technology we've got now, where people have devices that are not obvious, where they can let others know if violence is escalating or if aggression is escalating. That's really made the difference, the technology, I think.
So that's sometimes a secret thing that happens in terms of the technology given to people who might be at risk in private. There's a way of keeping it secret so they can reach out. Is that how it works?
Yes. Yep.
Thanks. Mostly, and we just spoke to the team here, mostly it involves the perpetrator leaving the home or the family leaving the home. And it might be the case that this program will fund works like CCTV, panic alarms, back to base communication that can allow someone who is in fear of their life, who's the victim of a violent partner, from re-entering their lives, and it creates and supplies a measure of security. It's not going to be for everybody and it can't be applied in all circumstances, but it's a program that's been rigorously researched and we believe works.
Part of the extent of the funding that's going to be outlined in the budget?
Sorry?
Is this the extent of the funding that's going to be outlined in the budget?
No, I think you can expect more in relation to housing in particular. So much of the important intervention that state governments in particular can make to help a family fleeing an unsafe, violent environment is to ensure that they've got a roof over their head. And we are faced with two extremely difficult challenges. Firstly, the rise, and it's undeniably the case, the rise in the instances and reporting of domestic violence in the state, alongside completely unaffordable housing solutions for New South Wales. And those two things have meant that in some instances, women in particular are staying in violent, unsafe situations longer than they should because they feel that they've got no options and no alternatives. And secondly, they're leaving the household and potentially being homeless as a result.
Your government already made a commitment to the federal government to hire 118 new DV frontline workers by June 30. How many of those have been hired to date?
I couldn't tell you the number, but I freely admit that staffing, particularly for the sector, is one of the primary challenges that not just the government is facing, but the NGO sector as well. Benevolent just told us that they'd love to be able to roll out more programs, and as a result of some of the initiatives that we've been able to fund, they've increased the FTE by, I think, 0.6 for this particular program. We'd love to see more of it. It's going to be a perennial problem in an expensive city like Sydney, but we believe this will make a difference.
Does Minister Harrison know the number, and are you concerned because part of your package included extra funding for more DV support staff in the justice system, that you just won't be able to deliver those numbers?
There's actually, in New South Wales, we've recruited 5 specialist workers as part of the federal commitment. The reason there was considerable amount of consultation between the federal government. We needed to make sure that where we were rolling out workers actually matched where they'd previously committed workers. We also needed to make sure that we were putting workers in the areas where they were most needed. So there was a considerable amount of work needing to be done to analyse where there were gaps. So we looked at crime statistics. We consulted heavily with people who are working on the ground about what their experiences were in relation to the unmet need. So we're in the process of procurement right now, and we're working really heavily with the domestic violence sector to get them rolled out.
Just to clarify, that's 5 out of 118.
That's 5 workers.
So we'll have to give you the number on where we're up to in terms of recruitment.
What is the problem, though, I suppose? Why is it so hard to get people to do these jobs, and how's that?
So
You're hiring them.
As an employer, I'm happy to answer that. Right across the human services not-for-profit sector, we're running at around 20% undercooked in terms of workforce. So part of it is during the pandemic, we closed down services right across the nation. A lot of workers left us to go to hospitality and haven't come back because it's hard to attract and retain professional people. It's just, we're not, and it's not a criticism of any government, but the funding is still quite low. We still operate in this country as if human services are a charitable act that is funded by wealthy individuals. In fact, we fund them collectively through our taxation dollars as Australian citizens. So if we want more domestic violence workers on the ground, we've got to tell our governments and our elected representatives that we want them. And you see here people standing behind me who are starting to respond to that. But it's not a fast turnaround. In terms of specialist domestic violence workers, we don't have them kind of on ice in a cool box somewhere ready to activate. It's training people, it's the pipelines of training. And I have to say, in lots of our services, we have often forgotten to provide funding for graduates. When I bring a graduate on into any of my services, we lose about 6 months of competent worker time on the ground because these are young people straight out of university and they need to be trained and they need to be mentored and they need to have clinical governance wrapped around them to ensure that when we're putting workers out there in the community to do specialised high-value jobs, they're competent to do those things. So it's a complex story. We're kind of on it as a nation, but it's going to be a bit of a slow turnaround.
We spoke on Friday to Rosie Batty, and she said that words to the effect that she didn't want to see a sole focus on police and courts. Right. Today, obviously, we've got this package that doesn't focus on that. How important is it for you as well, knowing the people that come through, the women and the children that come through here? Do you often see that they don't want to go through the court process? Do you often see that that's not the avenue they want to take? They want to be safe. I mean, what do you see?
So I think it's fair to say that by the time women are at a service like ours, in a centre like ours, they're desperate to be safe and to create a safe and stable home environment for themselves and their children. And I think, again, this package kind of hits the highlights of what you need to do. So as a nation, we need to invest more heavily than we currently are in specialised services like the ones we run here. The staying home, leaving violence is just one of a number of specialised services. But more than that, we need to be providing, so that's the spine, and then we need to be investing in the general services. Are we providing enough across the nation funding and resourcing to be able to roll out really good child, youth and family services across the nation? We do a lot of family preservation work. We do need to look at our policing systems and our court systems to make sure they're women-friendly and women-focused. And so I think there's sort of a social change part of this that all of us are responsible for as citizens. Over the last few days, as I've been listening to the women that work here and in other locations of ours across the parts of the nation we provide services, what the single message coming through after they run me through the kind of policy conversation is what we really need is men to start holding other men to account. And we talked, I was speaking to some of our staff last night, and we talked about that being an individual thing, that we need individual men to hold other men to account. But we need to see that in a systems way as well, and that probably goes to our male-dominated court and policing system. So again, there isn't a silver bullet that will fix domestic and intimate family violence. There isn't. But I think, my view is, as a nation, we are starting to understand that you need integrated services, you need long-run investment, and we need to see social change. And certainly the Benevolent Society we founded in 1813, we're a very long-run charity, we've always stepped up around social change, and this is something we're really keen to continue to work with governments, with Corporate Australia, with other community organisations on.
And so Rose, just a question for you. A lot of these places like the Benevolent Society, other domestic violence shelters and that, they say that they're just at capacity. They're having to turn people away, which I can only imagine would be incredibly heartbreaking, goes against what you guys do. What do you need from government? Is it funding? Is it long-term embedded funding so that you're not waiting for budget cycles to keep this going?
So I think, what do we need from government? It is. I hate to say this all the time. It sounds like a whiner, but it is funding. It is about long-run funding, but it's also data-driven funding. So let's find out Let's actually get the data and be able to look at the data to see where the need is and make sure we're funding where the need is, when the need is. And that means organisations like mine need to be in a constant dialogue with funders, whether those funders are governments or philanthropic organisations or ordinary Australians, giving charities like mine $20 a week. Please do that, ordinary Australians. We use every dollar. Or corporate Australia. So it's wherever the funding comes from, it's actually lining it up and pointing it to where it needs to be. And all of us need to be held account for that, I think.
Mr. Jackson. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. That's fine. Can I just ask you spoke quite passionately on Friday about education. I noticed that there is some money in this for an early childhood pilot. What is that? What does it focus on? And can you walk us through what that's going to look like?
Well, I think the important element of that investment is that it's going to be co-designed with educators and young people. So we absolutely need to get serious about the conversations that we're having in our schools. I had a meeting with the Youth Affairs Committee yesterday, which is the group of young people who across New South Wales Government express the voices of youth into our policy decision making. This, of course, was top of the agenda for them. They talked about the gaps in school. They talked about the fact that in recent times there had been a little bit more in terms of consent dialogue in the classroom, but really when it came to harassment, when it came to violence, when it came to intimate family relations, that was a real gap for them, and they weren't seeing those conversations in the classroom. They were really clear to me, government, don't come up with a program that's cringy and written by adults and bring it into schools and expect that to make a difference. And this funding is about developing a program with young people, with educators, that actually works. There's no time or space here for waste. We have to get on with it and we have to do things that work. And critically important then when it comes to that education element, that schools-based element, is it going to cut through? Is it going to cause a young boy of 10 or 12 or 15 to stop and think, how am I interacting with girls? How does my dad treat my mum? To get that cut through, to get that moment, you have to listen to young people. So I'm really excited that we're putting money into this, but I'm also really clear it's got to be done well, it's got to be designed with young people, and it's got to cut through. But that conversation has to start now.
Is that how young they need to be? 10, 8, 10 little boys? That's where we need to start the conversation?
Absolutely. We need to recognise that these are conversations that need to start at the primary level. Obviously that age-appropriate content at primary and high school, but it's really clear that when it comes to what love is, what a good family is, how to treat other people, kindness, empathy, these should not be foreign concepts, but unfortunately when it comes to the way that some family dynamics are working, clearly they are. And so starting conversations with young people and then right through adolescence about what it looks like to love someone and express that in a respectful way is something that we're going to do, we're going to fund, and we're going to do it right. And I'm actually quite excited by that. We know we have to do urgent work now. We have to address housing. We have to address the way that police and courts are interacting with male perpetrators of violence against women. But we also need to look to the future. And this is the generational stuff. This is the stuff that in that 10, 15 years' time, we're hopefully going to be having a different conversation because we will have moved the dial. But we've got to start now, and this funding is linked to that.
Domestic violence.
The $45 million for criminal justice reform, can you give us a taste of what will be encompassed within that?
No, not today.
Domestic Violence New South Wales is calling for $54 million to support the work crisis refuges are already doing. Will we see that support committed this week?
We're continuing to talk with Domestic Violence New South Wales. They're the peak body that represent a whole bunch of organisations that work day and night. It goes to some of the questions that have already been asked at this media conference about labour shortages and human resources. What I would say is a couple of things. Firstly, so much of today's package is about long-term sustainable investment in the prevention of domestic violence. What that means is we have to be there for the long run. And it means that organisations like the Benevolent Society and others that do amazing work in the community can start plotting their timelines, not just for the next 12 months or 2 years, but 3 or 4 years beyond that. When you've got such a labour-intensive and confronting job, because if you work in this sector, it's not easy, you need to put time into training and counselling for those that work in the sector. So we're going to be here for a long time. This is not one-off funding. There's a commitment and a realisation from the New South Wales Government that we cannot put an injection of funds and then withdraw it at a later time. So the sector was very clear with us in relation to this. They welcome this announcement, but it's got to be long-term and sustainable so that they can start planning and plotting for the future.
Just back on Max's question, sorry.
Yeah.
Obviously, you flagged that you're going to be looking at legislative changes in the justice system. Will you be looking at the Coalition's bill this week to look at what some of that might look like?
Well, look, we're going to develop our own policy. I'd urge lawmakers in New South Wales to work with the government over the next week. We're in the midst of developing that. I've allocated funding in today's package because I want to make sure that it's ready to roll out as soon as potential legislation passes. When it comes to the opposition, I'd just say they had 12 years to do something. Where were they?
So could we just clarify, just on Max's question, that you say you're still working on that package? It's not that you're holding off that to announce another day, it's that you are still working through what that bail reform, what those justice reforms would look like?
Yes, that's true. They're complex. The truth of the matter is there's no single bit of legislation that can make the kind of change that we want to see. So it needs to be done in coalition, if you like, with an increase in the funding package. But I didn't want to wait, have this money quarantined or set aside while we're developing the complex criminal justice response, other than to say today that there will be and there needs to be a criminal justice response to the scourge of domestic and family violence in New South Wales, and in particular that focus will be on bail.
Slightly off topic, Premier, will we... You go, Liz. Oh, it's a different topic.
Yeah, well, just in terms of the legislation for the change, do you still need to wait for the review first before you...
No, we don't.
You're not going to?
We're not going to. I believe we've got the expertise and we've got the working groups in place that are developing a policy response right now. I'm not announcing it today, but it's not far away.
Is there... sorry, just you've got a review going on, so what then happens today if it says something different to what you do?
Well, that is in relation to a few things. Firstly, there's a particular review from Kel SC who's looking at the particulars of the registrar's decision in relation to the matter that's before the courts. That's important in informing the public's understanding of what happened. And it's still important that we understand what happened for that particular decision. The bail reform group is not just looking at that particular issue, but bail in general. Our policy response will be in relation to domestic and family violence, and we're not far away from announcing it.
It's slightly different.
How we define success in this space, and what timelines are you looking on to define that success?
Yeah, that's a really fair question because so much of the call-outs from New South Wales Police and many of the matters heard in the local district and Supreme Court have to do with domestic and family violence in New South Wales. But we cannot be in a situation where everybody throws their hands up and says it's just too hard. And if you look in particular at Victoria, 10 years after their Royal Commission into Domestic and Family Violence, they've rolled out a series of programs. They've kept funding high. They've ensured that it's ongoing. They haven't just had an intervention of new funding and then withdrawn that funding a few years afterwards as inevitably other issues come onto the agenda. They're seeing domestic violence in the community decline, whereas we've gone the other way. Ours has increased over the same period of time. Now that's a legacy and a record that we have to take responsibility for, and it means that we need both a criminal justice response as well as a funding response. This is the beginning of it today.
Just on a different topic, Premier, the knife laws, potential JACS laws, will they be introduced tomorrow?
I don't have an announcement in relation to that, but there's obviously a lot going on in New South Wales at the moment, and you can expect an announcement in relation to that soon as well.
Premier, this money's spread over 4 years. How long will groups that need the money now and support agencies be waiting to see that cash? Is it front-loaded, or how are you figuring that out?
Yeah, it's equalised, and it represents about a 23% increase in operational funding across the sector.
So this is new money?
It's new money. It is new money. Recognition from the New South Wales government that we need to do more, that more money for these essential programs are fundamental to saving lives and keeping families safe. Second point here is that, as you can see, there's no single initiative, whether it's criminal justice reform, housing, intervention programs, primary education programs, helping navigating the alphabet soup of agencies and NGOs. It's a complex response, and government's response has got to be complex as well. So you can see today's announcement's $230 million, but it's spread all the way from direct interventions for those who are fleeing family and domestic violence, as well as money set aside for criminal justice reform, all the way along to a primary prevention program, which is about changing hearts and minds so that people don't fall into terrible, violent behaviour.
Sorry, I know we've touched on this before, but in terms of those underfunded crisis accommodation services, can they expect funding?
Look, you'd appreciate that we've got a budget process to go through. I'm not trying to be coy about it, but that's ongoing. We expect the sector to engage with us in the next few weeks as we bed down the budget, but we didn't want to wait, particularly as we know so many NGOs are preparing their budgets for the coming financial year, for this announcement a day longer than was needed or required. So yes, there'll be more to do, more to say. Our two areas of focus beyond this immediate upfront human resource funding is housing, criminal justice reform for those that are on bail for serious domestic and family violence offences.
Yeah, just on the Royal Commission, have you decided against one for the time being? Or?
Yeah, look, it's a very reasonable question, and the calls for a Royal Commission in New South Wales are completely valid, and we've assessed it and looked at it very closely, and these are the reasons why. Firstly, there is difficulty from criminologists in determining some commonalities amongst perpetrators of domestic violence. In other words, some come from wealthy backgrounds, some don't. Some have been in long-term relationships with their intimate partner, some have just met. Some are estranged and some are still in that relationship. Some have criminal records, some don't have any criminal record at all. So I can understand, given the complexity of trying to identify who are high-risk potential aggressors in the community, that you need answers to some of these questions. And when you look at the complex policy solutions, they're even more difficult. So a Royal Commission, obviously, if you look at it from the perspective of trying to solve this entrenched, difficult problem, is attractive for the government. But it does two things. Firstly, it costs money and it takes time. And we've made a decision, having worked closely with the domestic violence sector, the stakeholders in the community, that we don't have any time. The money's got to get into the sector straight away, and we'd rather that money go directly to organisations that can roll out programs as soon as possible. We haven't taken that decision lightly, and we certainly haven't brushed off calls for a Royal Commission. I understand they're coming from a good place where there's a lot of unanswered questions for a complex problem. But I've got confidence that the domestic violence prevention sector in New South Wales knows what they're doing. They just need the funds to get on with it.
But just to come around to the question I asked before about defining success, I mean, you obviously talked about Victoria in a 10-year timeline. Surely you'll be looking at shorter increments to understand how these policies are going.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly wasn't trying to give the impression that judge us in 10 years' time. The point I was trying to make is that they've invested over a prolonged period of time. They haven't had a flash-in-the-pan investment when it comes to the prevention of domestic violence. And in terms of the prevalence of it in their community, it still exists in Victoria. It's lower than it is in New South Wales. That's what we want to. We want to see less domestic violence in our community. We want to see these programs work. We want to put particularly women in a position where they can be safe from the perpetrators of violence by working with either the New South Wales government or one of these wonderful organisations.
It's set to rain a lot over the next week.
Past you guys.
Issues coming up again and again regarding Warragamba Dam.
Yeah.
Is the government considering diversifying water there so that we can run it at a lower level so we don't keep running into the same problem?
We are considering it, but the decision to do that has to be made by supplementing Sydney's drinking water somewhere else. And I realise that might be cold comfort when you're looking at, a La Nina weather pattern that will see more rainfall in the coming months. But even an investment to raise Warragamba Dam, what would be 10 years in the making? So we're looking closely at an infrastructure spend to supplement Sydney's drinking water and as a result take pressure off the low-lying areas of northwestern Sydney. But we've said this every time and it's really important. There's no single strategy that we can pursue here. What we do need to do is ensure that we don't build more housing on the floodplain to put more people at risk of dying as a result of floods in the community. And secondly, make sure that those emergency evacuation routes are up and running. And we're committed to getting on with that at the same time.
Just on today's road announcement,
Yeah.
are you expecting more money from the feds for New South Wales road infrastructure?
Well, look, I'd just say in relation to that, it's welcome. And we've criticised the federal government in the last few months in relation to infrastructure spending in New South Wales, but you've got to give credit where it's due. These are major arterial roads in Western Sydney. The money is desperately needed, and we're very grateful that the federal government stood up and put money into Western Sydney. They've made the right decision here, and it will make a major difference for those communities and Western Sydney Airport. That kind of billion-dollar investment from the Commonwealth Government means that we can make Western Sydney Airport a success. We've got the public transport link. The airport's on the way to being completed. We just needed those road connections, and Albo's come to the party here, so we're very grateful.
But is today's announcement enough to make up for the dud deals New South Wales has been getting on infrastructure?
Look, any New South Wales Premier in any circumstances will be calling for more, and I'm no different.
Have you been briefed on the knife attack in Perth and whether or not there's any concern about links and youth terror cells in New South Wales?
The latest information I have is that there's no link, but if there's a change to that advice, of course, we'd make the public aware of that. New South Wales Police, particularly the Counter-Terrorism Command, is working very hard to ensure the public's safe, and as you can see, over the last month, they're diligent in ensuring that they act in relation to intelligence or information they get for their criminal investigations.
Premier, just last on housing. Will you release the practical capacity of the Todd sites as opposed to theoretical capacity of obviously Cobson Point to Media?
Well, from you guys. Look, in relation to the amount that will be built on Todd sites across Sydney, it's in large measure up to the capacity of builders and developers in Sydney. And we were really clear about that from the beginning. We were going to lift the capacity of builders to put up buildings and increase the amount of construction. But there are a number of elements that also come into play. And that's a long way of saying we expect and we've hypothecated the amount of increased housing and density as a result of those Todd SEP changes. But they're estimates, and ultimately this will largely depend on how many builders can get those sites, build those buildings and create more supply, particularly for young Australians in one of the most expensive cities on earth. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.